What if evolution didn't conclude with extinction, but with coexistence? What if Neanderthals, those rugged, resilient cousins we once mocked as primitive, had never vanished, but remained beside us, building a parallel humanity in the shadows of our own? Imagine a world where Homo sapiens weren't the only survivors, where another kind of human, stronger, quieter, more grounded, shaped our cities, shared our homes, and carved their own place into history. This isn't science fiction. It's a plausible past-tone, evolutionary turn away from reality. What we see today as a lonely legacy might have been a shared inheritance. Two species walking the same earth, two minds interpreting the same firelight, one driven by abstraction, the other by instinct, one looking to the stars, the other to the stone. In this world, the word human is plural, and the story we were told may only be half of what truly happened. Imagine a world where the man leading your office doesn't wear tailored suits, but thick forearms and a heavy brow that hints at ancient endurance. His words are few, but his decisions are deliberate, measured. His eyes don't dart, they lock. Across the street, a crew pours concrete in the midday sun, and one figure among them, barrel-chested, stoic, doesn't tire, doesn't sweat. You see him every morning. You never ask his name. In this world, the Neanderthals never vanished. They walk among us not hidden, but unnoticed. Their presence is quiet. Not in boardrooms or celebrity news feeds, but in the backbone of society: construction sites, mechanic bays, farms, rescue teams, places where muscle, patience, and resolve are currency. They are neighbors, co-workers, family. A child in your son's classroom stares out the window more than he speaks. Teachers label him slow, but you've seen the way he builds things show. He studies the world not with noise, but with stillness. You wonder. At the bus stop, a broad man with deep-set eyes watches the sunrise like it's an old friend. He doesn't nod. He doesn't need to. He's not like you, but he's human. Not quite Homo sapiens. Not quite alien. Just different. And in that difference lies the beginning of a story we were never taught to see, because the past didn't end. It just kept walking beside us. Imagine walking through a city built not just for one kind of human, but two. Sidewalks reinforced for heavier strides, door frames wider, ceilings taller. Elevators calibrated to handle 200 kilos of silent, unmoving presence. Offices with quieter lighting because Neanderthal eyes strain under fluorescence. And emergency exits, twice the width. Not for fear of panic, but because their strength, in a crowd, is dangerous if unchanneled. Hospitals carry dual protocols, one for Homo sapiens, one for their heavier cousins, whose metabolism digests slowly, whose pain threshold confounds physicians, whose immune systems react with prehistoric logic. Their medical cards flag unique needs: higher protein diets, longer recovery times, no opioids, they don't respond to them. Public schools, tracked systems. Sapiens children thrive on stories and play. Neanderthal children need structure, repetition, tasks, not slower, just different. Exams adjusted. Classrooms designed for silence. Fewer questions. More tools. Even the military understands. Neanderthal units are deployed for endurance, brute tasks, storm response. Sapiens handle tactics, communication. Together, they operate like two halves of a single organism, complementary, not equal. And in the world of advertising, forget smiles. Campaigns aimed at Neanderthals use symbols, objects, texture. Faces don't sell, function does. This is not segregation. It's adaptation, not prejudice, but pragmatism. In this reality, we don't divide by color or creed, we organize by species. And somehow, it works. They don't speak unless they must. Not because they can't, but because they see no use in noise. In a Neanderthal household, silence isn't awkward, it's the default. Conversations are short, direct, sometimes just a glance or a nod. Children take longer to form words. Language comes slowly, but when it does, it carries weight. No babble, no filler. Just truth. You might see a Neanderthal man on a rooftop in winter, bare hands gripping steel, unmoved by the wind or the chill. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't shiver. He doesn't check the time. His focus is total. Pain doesn't stop him. Distraction doesn't reach him. He works until the job is done, not for praise, not for recognition, but because purpose is the only fuel he needs. These men aren't chatty in break rooms. They don't join office parties. They don't laugh at jokes. They don't find funny. They show up, get it done, and go home. To them, bonding is not about beer or backslaps. It's about building something that lasts. They don't ask if you like them. They ask what needs doing. In a world like this, sapiens learn to read the quiet, to respect the pause before a word, to understand that stillness can be strength, that a man who says nothing might still be listening, still deciding. We grew up thinking communication made us human. But maybe, in their eyes, clarity is what mattered. Not connection, not confession, just the work and the will to see it through. This is how they survive. It didn't begin with words. There were no treaties, no fireside meetings, no cautious diplomacy. Just a momentous sound in the brush, a shadow across the tree line. The sudden realization, we are not alone. First contact wasn't a handshake. It was a stare held too long, a grip on a stone tool, a tightening of breath. Two species, shaped by different instincts, standing at the edge of each other's survival. Homo sapiens came with speed, language, abstraction. Neanderthals held the land through strength, memory, endurance. And when the ice retreated and the forests grew thick again, their paths collided. A cave that once belonged to one now belonged to both. A river once solitary now mirrored the footsteps of another kind of human. They didn't understand each other, but they recognized the hunger. Both needed food, warmth, space. There was no hate, not yet, only friction. Tension, not because of who they were, but what they were. Two apex species equal in will, unequal in design, trying to breathe the same air. There were no leaders to stop it, no gods to arbitrate, only instinct and the bitter truth of survival. One fire is never enough for two families. What followed wasn't war in the modern sense. It was pressure. 1,000 small encounters, some cautious, some deadly, each one pushing the world closer to the edge. And for a time, that edge held, until it didn't. Intelligence wears many faces. For Homo sapiens, it meant speed, mental and physical. We processed fast, spoke faster, dreamed up tools, maps, myths. We used symbols to shape our world, stories to pass it on. Every problem became a puzzle to solve. Every stranger, a negotiation. We moved like wind across the plains, restless, curious, strategic. But the Neanderthal mind was another kind of brilliance. Slower, yes, but only on the surface. Beneath it, depth. They watched what we missed, listened to what we ignored. Where we rushed to speak, they paused to understand. Their memory was long, their sense of place, absolute. Caves weren't just shelter, they were archives. Every stone, every groove remembered. Sapiens invented. Neanderthals refined. We made tools by the dozen. They perfected the few they trusted. We worked in bursts. They endured in rhythm. Their intelligence wasn't flashy. It was embodied, stored in muscle, in silence, in the dirt beneath their feet. And when we crossed paths, we didn't see equals. We saw other. We called them primitive. But what we mistook for slowness was restraint. What we saw as emotionless was focus. We chased stars. They studied shadows. And while we named the world, they knew it. Two minds. Two kinds of genius. Not one better, just different. It didn't start with hatred, it started with winter. As the climate shifted and ice released its grip, new lands opened, but not enough for everyone. Valleys once rich with game grew barren. Rivers froze earlier, thawed later. Trees bore fewer fruits. The animals, those that hadn't fled, were hunted to exhaustion. And two species with ancient appetites found themselves circling the same scraps. Territories overlapped. A cave used by Neanderthals for generations now had sapiens fires in it. A well-trodden migration trail became crowded with foreign footprints. Watering holes, once quiet, echoed with unfamiliar voices. At first, there were standoff-scold eyes across the clearing, tense moments that dissolved into retreat. But hunger doesn't compromise. Children crying through the night, elders wasting away, mothers failing to feed. Survival doesn't leave room for diplomacy. And so it began. Skirmishes turned into patterns, clashes over hunting zones, ambushes near cave mouths, the quiet thud of stone on bone. There were no flags, no declarations. Just blood spilled over warmth, food, and water. This was not a war of flags or gods. It was older, a species war, fought not to dominate but to endure. And in the smoke of that struggle, something terrible and true emerged. There was only room for one winner. Not because one was evil, but because the world had limits, and both sides wanted to live. At some point, the killing paused, not because hearts softened, but because the winters grew too long. The blood cost too high. Wounds festered. Bodies didn't recover. Even survival has its price, and both sides began to see it. A new kind of campfire appeared done that didn't burn in either territory, but somewhere between. No words spoken. Just smoke rising. Neanderthals arrived first, silent, eyes sharp. Then sapiens, cautious, blades visible. But no war cries came, only offerings. They had meat fresh, smoked, hunted with precision. We had pigments colors drawn from earth and fire, used to mark, to teach, to remember. They brought furs thick enough to survive northern winds. We offered obsidian bladesmall, fast, fatal. No one said, "Thank you." They just nodded and walked away. These weren't markets. These were exchanges, not of wealth, but of weakness. We traded to fill what we lacked. They observed our fire-making. We mimicked their snares. They saw how we bound wounds. We learned how they stored cold meat underground. Each meeting was a lesson in humility. Out of these smoky gatherings, something strange began to form. Hybrid camps, not truly sapien, not truly Neanderthal, just survivors. Rough shelters, mixed tools, shared watch shifts. Not peace, not yet, but something more ancient. mutual need. Long before trust, there was curiosity. We watched them first out of fear mostly. Their silence unnerved us. Their movements were slow, deliberate. It was like watching the earth breathe. But we saw things. A Neanderthal woman, kneeling by a wound, packing it with moss knot cloth or salve. But something natural, ancient. Days later, the wound sealed clean. We took note. We saw them build fires, not in open air, but under stone ledges, where wind couldn't touch it. We copied that too, and how they stalked game utterly still, downwind, no movement for hours. While we told stories around fires, they became the shadows behind the deer. Their patience was brutal, surgical. We began to imitate, but what surprised us most was that they watched us back. They noticed how we spoke, not just what we said, but how we wove it into stories. How children gathered when elders spoke of fire gods or animals that once flew. They saw how stories made us act, made us believe, made us remember, and slowly, some of them lingered at the edges of our circles, just beyond firelight listening. They heard how we sang to children, even before they could speak. They watched us draw animals on wall symbols of what was or what could be. They didn't understand it at first, but they didn't look away. What began as fear shifted into something else. Not trust, not yet, but fascination. No one planned for them. They weren't part of the story either side meant to write. And yet, they arrived. Children born between species, part Neanderthal, part sapiens, not fully one, not fully the other. Some came from darkness violence in the night, driven by desperation or dominance. Others were born of choice, quiet bonds formed in rare, fragile moments of understanding. But no matter how they came into the world, they bore it on their faces. The heavy brow of one parent, the wide eyes of the other, muscles that matured too early, words that arrived too late. Most were cast aside, feared, too strange for one camp, too silent for the other. They didn't belong to stories or traditions. They were glitches in the order. But in the wild, usefulness outweighs sentiment. Some of these children boys especially grew strong. And if they could speak like sapiens, but fight like Neanderthals, they became indispensable. They could interpret gestures and commands, carry weight and meaning between tribes. They hunted with one, reasoned with the other. They didn't bring peace. They brought survival. These children weren't symbols. They were tools, sharp-edged, adaptable, often alone. But in the hands of the right elderer, the right crisis, they became something more, bridges between two worlds that were never meant to meet. Not born to unite, born to endure. Once the first hybrid child lived long enough to prove useful, the questions began. Could he teach? Could she lead? Were they one of user, something new? The answers didn't come quickly. They weren't written in stone or decided by vote. They were negotiated quietly, painfully, over generations, around fires, over meals, during births, after deaths. Some tribes chose to mix, out of necessity, out of curiosity, or simply because it made survival easier. These communities created new customs: who was allowed to speak during meetings, who could lead a hunt, who inherited tools or names. These weren't laws in the way we understand them today. They were lived agreements understood, enforced, sometimes broken, but always adapted. Others drew hard lines. No mixing, no hybrids, camps that clung to purity of blood, of speech, of ritual. They watched from a distance, shaking their heads, convinced that compromise was weakness. But even they felt the pressure, the way the world was bending. Hybrid villages became borderland zones of uneasy innovation. A Neanderthal-built shelter with sapiens fire pits. Children taught in 2 languages. Rituals that blended song with silence, pigment with stone. These places weren't peaceful, but they worked. Humanity didn't break. It flexed. And somehow, despite bloodlines, instincts, and old wounds, it held together. Not perfectly, not forever, but long enough to matter. Even as fires were shared and bloodlines crossed, the 2 species never truly became one. Homo sapiens remained restless. We made meaning from chaos rituals to explain storms, gods to explain fear. We built theaters to mimic life, and myths to transcend it. We looked to the skies and asked what lay beyond them. To us, everything had to mean something. Every death, a story. Every star, a symbol. Neanderthals stayed grounded. They built with stone and memory. When a mountain blocked the sun, they mapped its shadow not to worship it, but to understand it. They hunted not for glory, but for need. They never asked why a river curved. They learned how it flowed. Their lives were practical, rooted in what could be touched, felt, endured. Where we danced in circles, they stood still. Where we asked questions, they found patterns. And yet, both lived. The interbreeding didn't erase the differences. It recorded them in bone density, in immune systems, in quiet traits passed down to children who never knew why they loved solitude, or why pain didn't stop them the way it did others. Our DNA ores today isn't pure sapiens. It's a fossilized treaty, a genetic handshake. The story of our species isn't one of conquest. It's one of coexistence, uneasy, imperfect, real. 2 paths that diverged for millennia, and then, for a time, walked side by side. Imagine growing up in a world where the word human was plural, where every child learned 2 history zones traced through paintings and poetry, the other through stone tools and silence. School books told of 2 brains, 2 instincts, 2 ways of facing the cold. Evolution wasn't a straight line, it was a forked path, and both branches survived. In this world, the evening news doesn't just cover politics, and Bordersit reports tensions between species. A Neanderthal-led labor union, a sapiens-led protest about representation. Heated debates over mixed species education. Not racism, speciesism. Older, deeper, harder to dismantle. You sit on a train. Across from you, a man with a wide nose and heavy brow reads without expression. He doesn't look up. He doesn't smile. But he's not strange to you. He's your mechanic, your cousin-in-law, the quiet neighbor who helped lift your car when no one else could. And in that moment, looking into his deep-set eyes, you don't wonder who he is. You wonder who you are. Which parts of you came from firelight and story, and which from the silence before it? Because in this world, humanity didn't win alone. It adapted with company. We were never the only ones. And maybe, if fate had twisted just slightly, we still wouldn't be. They weren't mistakes. They weren't dead ends. Neanderthals were never failures of evolution. They were survivors built for endurance, shaped by ice, tested by silence. Their disappearance wasn't inevitable. It wasn't fate or weakness. It was a convergence of climate, chance, and contact. 1,000 small events that tipped the balance of existence. A historical accident, not a biological sentence. Had that balance shifted even slightly, everything we know as human might look different. Our languages, our cities, our relationships, even our wars. They would have been shaped not by one kind of mind, but two. But though their bodies faded, the Neanderthals never fully left. They remain in our bones, in our blood, in the way some of us carry pain without complaint, or navigate the woods by instinct, or find comfort in solitude. They remain in fragments of DNA, in traces of memory older than history. They are not myths. They are the other half of our story. If this vision stirred something in you, subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows. We don't just recount the past. We resurrect the worlds that could have been, because history is written by those who endured, but prehistory that belongs to the bold, the curious, the imaginative. At Prehistoric Shadows, we shine a light on the forgotten, the erased, the nearly possible. Neanderthals didn't vanish. They echo in us,